part 2 of how and why the settler colony of Israel became the vegan capital of the world. Make sure to watch part 1 to understand the Israeli government's connection to vegan washing and how they use animal rights as part of their official propaganda. As I discuss the timeline of Israel's vegan story, I want you to keep this figure in mind. Israel went through 4 stages over the past 15 years, starting with the vegan revolution, which was co opted by the government to make it part of their national identity in order to gain moral superiority so that they would become the world's vegan capital. So, a prominent animal rights activist, who you probably know, his name is Gary Yourofsky, went viral for his famous speech that he gave at a lecture in 2010. This was not in Israel, this was in the US. However, Israelis loved his animals only approach because that meant that they can finally be the saviors of an oppressed group without having to confront the injustice of human beings that they're oppressing in Palestine. Here's an interesting story. There was a study made by Erica Wise, the author of the article, There Are No Chickens in Suicide Vests: The Decoupling of Human Rights and Animal Rights in Israel. Very interesting title. I encourage you to read the article in full. Erica highlights that between the years 2007 and 2009, she conducted the research where she found that the majority of Jewish Israelis who refused to perform their mandatory service in the army, which is the very bare minimum a settler should do, happened to be vegetarian or vegan. They define themselves as pacifists. She states, and I quote, I eventually found that the reasons underlining their opposition to eating animals were closely related to the reasons for their conscientious objection to military service. However, after Gary's speech spread widely across the settler colony, some of those animal rights activists who were anti-occupation changed their minds because they found out that the siege and the blockade helped keep animals from being eaten by Palestinians. Here are 2 examples with quotes. In 2013, somebody with the name of Santiago Gomez was interviewed, where he explained that he now supports the Israeli occupation because the embargo limits the numbers of cows allowed into Palestine, and because Israeli military attacks have caused the near collapse of the Gaza fishing industry. So basically, he now supports the oppression of Palestinians because he thinks that that will minimize the oppression of animals due to the blockade and siege that Israel created on Gaza. In a 2013 article on Plus 972, they highlight animal rights activist with the name Daniel Ehrlich and how he explained that he left his West Bank activism behind after being invited to an action to help Palestinians rebuild chicken coops destroyed by the Israeli army. This just goes to show how Israelis are placing animal rights above human rights. Now, I'm not here to discuss the hierarchy, but I'm just saying that Israeli military is destroying any way of sustenance for Palestinians, and so-called anti-occupation activists would rather have Palestinians not able to have any sort of self-sovereignty because that helps reduce the exploitation of animals, supposedly. So the question now is, how did we go from vegans being against the occupation to promoting that very same occupation as the most vegan army? Well, that required a lot of internal propaganda in order to change Israelis' perspective of veganism and animal rights. And that happened directly by the government. Before I continue, take a look at this figure by Vegans for Palestine where they highlight 4 quadrants that cover Israel's vegan washing. The bottom section is for internal propaganda, split into vegan revolution and vegan nationalism, while the top section is for external propaganda, split into vegan superiority and vegan capital. All of these events are happening simultaneously to portray Israel as a cruelty-free entity to gain moral legitimacy, in order to be portrayed as a beacon of progressiveness for ethical consumption. The internal propaganda is meant for Jewish vegans to feel relevant to Israel and have a sense of national identity to want to live there, while the external propaganda is meant to divert the Western vegan community from criticizing Israel and attract global investments in its food tech industry. Now, let's go over some of the main events that took place over the years. Literally the year after that speech by Gary Yourofsky went viral, it was translated to Hebrew and promoted all across the settler colony. Guess who translated his speech? The former anti-occupation animal rights activist and his friend. And in 2011, the Israeli military immediately began offering plant-based alternatives to their war criminal soldiers. That was the first step of hijacking the vegan revolution and making it part of Israel's national identity. They needed to show that they would tailor to vegan Israelis to show them that this occupation is a moral and ethical entity. Just after incorporating this into the army, they began posting about it on social media, with the first record going back to 2012. Notice the title of this post? Veganism in the IOF is easier than you think. It's a clear sign of propaganda where they present the army as having a progressive image where it allows its ethical soldiers to refuse things like vaccines that are tested on animals because of their moral values. While in that very same year, they carried out attacks and strikes in Gaza, killing hundreds of Palestinians and injuring hundreds more. But obviously, they're ethical because they allow their soldiers to refuse to be part of exploiting animals. Notice the date that they published this? World Vegan Day. Also, why is a Hebrew speaking army advertising their morality in their vegan initiatives in English? Basically, because they're trying to paint that morality to Western audience, where veganism was starting to gain a little bit more traction. It's worth noting that veganism is not a new thing and it wasn't created by the West. Actually, it goes back thousands of years, and yes, including Arab countries, along a lot of other countries in the global south. But that's a conversation for another time. Shortly after that, a few events took place. One of them is the creation of the Israeli organization known as Vegan Friendly, which you probably have seen their logos all around the world. This vegan friendly organization, along with other members of the Israeli animal rights community, decided to host Gary Yourofsky in the settler colony to give lectures to Israelis about veganism. And they even took him into internationally recognized illegally occupied Palestinian territories, like the Israeli university called Ariel, built on top of the illegal settlement called Ariel that's located southwest of Nablus in the occupied West Bank. So, this visit to give lectures in this university is contrary to international law. And giving lectures there to Israeli settlers is nothing less than vegan washing this crime. Gary Yourofsky's speech was even screened by a government municipality in 2012, where they invited media figures in hopes it would push the agenda for the animals only approach within vegan activism. One of the attendees of this screening is named Miki Heimovich, and she was a TV personality or news anchor who is now a politician. And apparently, after watching the screening of Gary Yourofsky's speech, she immediately switched from being vegetarian to vegan. And eventually, she created the Israeli branch of the Meatless Monday campaign. It was later endorsed by the Israeli Knesset leader, the Israeli parliament, who later became the president. He's also involved with Joanna Landau from Vibe Israel, who we talked about earlier. Here she is with him at the launch of Vibe Israel. And in case you can't read that, it says the Israel Brand Narratives book. But also, Netanyahu invited Miki Heimovich to his house where he announced that he would be adopting the Meatless Monday campaign and his Netanyahu family would go meatless every Monday, hinting about his compassion for animal rights. This attracted the media's attention, and some even used it for propaganda by writing articles in Haaretz about it. Here's the direct quote from Eyal Meged, who wrote the article in Haaretz in 2013. After all, peace with the Arabs isn't going to happen. So why don't Livni and Netanyahu harness their futile efforts on talks with the Palestinians to a goal that would truly make us a light onto the nations? Why not make ourselves the champions of progress on an issue that enlightened people in the world take seriously? Now, this sentiment is not new. In fact, it can be traced back to 2010 when there was a bill in the Israeli parliament to ban fur, where it was stated that they, and I quote, should set an example to the rest of the world on this matter. This kind of echoes Israel's message to present itself as an exceptional entity and a beacon of light onto the nations, similar to the early Zionist myths of having a unique moral mission. Now, Netanyahu is involved in a lot of vegan washing propaganda that happens later on in this timeline, but keep that in mind that he was one of the first Israeli leaders to jump on this vegan trend and use the animal rights movement as part of their propaganda. These are only a few examples of the propaganda that was done internally to pump up Israelis into thinking veganism is going to be part of their national identity and have a moral superiority by applying the animals only approach in their vegan activism. We'll continue this conversation in part 3, where we discuss more about the global media's role in this, as well as how foreign Zionist entities applied this vegan washing propaganda to Western audiences, for example, in international animal rights events and even US campuses.